Boardroom Bound, Episode 55, How to Prepare for the Unexpected as a Board Director with Martha Josephson.
The board interview is much more of a philosophical conversation than a test of what you know. Don't be tempted to dive in deep in that interview. It is more of a how do we create value? How do we protect value in an uncertain world? And what are the priorities here for our stakeholders?
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes, including the two guides we're talking about, over at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's show, we're speaking with Martha Josephson. She is a partner at Egon Zehnder, has been there for several decades, and is an expert on placing board directors. She's done over 50 of them herself, and she's written two phenomenal guides that we're going to talk about today. Cheat sheets for you for building your board bio and the path that you need to get to the boardroom. So much information here today that's going to be easily actionable steps that you can take to advance your candidacy. Let's jump into the show. Martha Josephson, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
It's great to be here.
Well, I'm excited because when I think about the types of people our audience wants to learn from, a lot of the questions I get were, well, surely I need to connect with the executive search firms. I need to build my brand and my reputation with them. And I say, yes, and lots of other things you need to do. It's great to be aware of them, the right people to connect with, learning from the resources that they share, because there's so many great ideas out there. We have now had Egon Zehnder on the show before, and in my mind, they are one of the top 5 groups everybody should be talking to around the world. So thrilled to be talking about you today and the resources that you've brought. And maybe we can just set the scene for how you find the company. You've been very successful, been there for a long time, the roles and opportunities that you fill for people, and then we'll take it from there.
Great. Yeah, no, I've been at this for quite a while, over 2 decades. And board governance and the dynamics of the boardroom are absolutely central to what our firm does, whether we're looking to build CEO succession planning into boardrooms, whether it's understanding how the dynamics of the boardroom can contribute to stakeholder value preservation as well as growth, and really over the years trying to figure out how the complexion, the makeup, the casting of the board needs to change as our world changes.
And I like the way you've described it there. You've described it to me before. It's like you're casting a play when you're trying to fill the board seats. It's this probably a careful dance. You're trying to make sure that you have all the people with the right qualifications that are going to work really well, efficiently, and effectively together for the amount of work they've got to get done in a short period of time. That can't be an easy thing to do.
Well, and it's changed. So it used to, if you think about casting the play, it used to be that boards were cast with 8 to 10 Hamlets, and those Hamlets were white male public company CEOs. Mm-hmm. And the play worked for a long time, but then the world got more complicated, and you didn't need a room full of white male CEOs. You needed some diversity. You needed Ophelia. You needed not to draw this too far, but you needed different roles to be played by spiky experts rather than CEO generalists. Now, you still want a couple of the really experienced CEOs in the room. They're great coaches to the CEO who's reporting into this board. But, the world got complicated, and now you need maybe risk. Mm-hmm. Maybe you need digital. Maybe if you're doing business, heaven help you, in China or Russia, you need somebody who understands those markets or global markets in general. Mm-hmm. maybe you need somebody who's done a lot of M&A in their career if you're moving towards an inorganic growth component to your strategy. And all of these people are not going to be CEOs of public companies. So what we've found is that in our quest to diversify not just the gender of boards, not just the skin color or ethnic background of boards, but really the expertise that each individual board member brings to that room. And that's that kind of diversity. Oh, and even age diversity. For a big client, we recently placed a 30-year-old private company CEO that was smack dab in the middle of understanding how the demographics of their tech business will change. So what you've got is a much more complicated world and much more complicated thinking around board composition.
But at the same point, that creates so much opportunity, right? Because we know the statistics are really telling of, you can look at, say, like the graying of America. There are more directors over 75 than there are below 50. But obviously that's going to be changing over time. Plus, when you combine that with the diversity initiatives across boards about how they want different types of people in them, it means there's more paths for first-time directors than ever before, right? Are you seeing that sort of demand coming back from your clients saying, we're now more tolerant of having someone who's never done it before if they're the right fit for us?
Absolutely. That demand used to sort of stomp their feet and say there aren't enough qualified women, for example, on boards. And we would sort of say, well, let's talk about that. So, creating the demand that would open up a broader pipeline, a broader aperture of people you'd consider for the board. That's been the past 5 years, really an exploding change in the conversations we have with clients. And then by redefining who you'll consider as spiky and top of their game that you'll put on boards, that's also increased the supply of people saying, I can add the following to a board. Does that make sense? And we'll tell them yes or no. Maybe you're ready, maybe you're not, but we'll tell them yes or no. And it's certainly our target lists for board placement have become just much more heterogeneous.
And when you think about, I know we'll talk about supply and demand for a moment because I love that analogy, the way you used it. Your job, you're working for a company and you're filling a board role, but you're also counseling them and coaching them. So you might have some organizations that are moving very quickly to diversify and others that are perhaps slower to adopt that mentality. I imagine you're able to give them a sense of the market and the types of people are available, and you're probably also trying to figure out how to counsel them. If you don't perhaps broaden your scope, you might miss out on someone really good. How are you, in a sense, moving the market to understand the supply and dynamic better?
It's counseling, keep an open mind. So recently there was a giant, over 60 billion European company public board, which the average age on that board was late 60s, mid 70s, something like that. It was very undiverse. And we started to show them profiles of individuals who would both serve a spike, a demand for expertise on the board, but they also take the average age of the board down. But we also counsel them, you have to be pretty flexible. Now, the person we placed on that board is 37, or was at the time 37, and I couldn't tell when I interviewed her that she was pregnant, but by the time we got around to her flying to Europe, she was 8 months pregnant. So I counseled the board. I said, wait 2 months. And then the board flew her and her new baby and her mother to take care of the baby to her board interview. And that was sort of heroic. A board that had never thought that one of them might be pregnant and have an infant. And I thought it was really good of them, and they got a fantastic board member who probably would have just been dropped out of the process 10 years ago.
And it is interesting for, the first board that I sat on was very pale, male, and stale, and I was the diversification because I was younger. And I remember also when I worked for a strategy consulting company, the board was all men, and they enacted a policy for females going on maternity leave. And once they rolled it out, it was terribly received. It was very poorly thought through, and it got pushed back. And the board said, what was the problem? We didn't have any women involved in the conversation. And now it's just an easy example, right? So you want different people around the table making different thoughts. And I love that story of a new mother coming in for the board interview. That's fantastic. Well,
but they made it happen. The old white guys made it happen, and it's a great example of how she was brave enough to do it, and they were courageous and sensitive enough to make it as easy as possible for her to join.
Well, I imagine in some ways, since we are starting to hear great stories like that, and I think that is wonderful, I'd love to use that as a case study, when we start to hear about how companies are beginning to change their mentality and their mindset because they will cast a wider net to find the right person. That's a wonderful idea. Get the right person in the role. It also allows your job to be, maybe it's harder, I'm not sure, better, more fun, because you have more people that you're talking to. You're casting a wider net in terms of the people that you need to bring in. And to some extent, you might be coming up, and please tell me how this works, finding somebody you think, I think this person would be a great board director, but they may not have thought about it. Maybe they're younger, maybe they're 30s and didn't think they're ready for a board yet. And maybe some of what you're doing is coaching them that they could be a candidate, and perhaps that's partly why you built this guide that you've got today. Can you talk us through those dynamics?
Yeah, so there was one person in my mind who broke open the young women should wait to go on boards, and that was our friend Sheryl Sandberg. She just made it okay to say, I'm going to reach for this. And so I started reaching to all kinds of people who shared her characteristics, relatively young, top of their game, hugely influential, and I said, why don't you think about boards? And then people started seeking me out saying, am I ready for a board? And then one time I was sitting in a room with someone who said, you should really write all this advice down. And that became our guide to Path to the Boardroom, our guide to how you can network to get on a board, how you interview for a board, which is super different from interviewing for a job, and what do you do when you get in a boardroom so you're adding value and you feel like you belong. And so we wrote it all. So we wrote it all down, and it became that guide, which I think is the most downloaded thing ever in our firm's history. But
I think that probably says a lot about where the business might be going in the future. But I love the guide. I've got it in front of me. It's fantastic. It's such an easy read, and it's chock full of great data. And it's funny because you talk about three things there, and I'm sure some of our audience would imagine totally get the first two. See, that's why it's valuable. Why would I need the third one? But we have some of our audience who are in that position where they've gotten the first board role, and they go, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? How do I be successful? So that is a key part of it as well. But I would love if we just talk about each of these. So clearly positioning yourself for a first-time board service. I imagine for someone who is wanting to network with someone like yourself going, oh my gosh, Egon, Zehnder, and Martha, they have all these opportunities. This is great. It's a busy place out there. There is a huge amount of supply. It seems to be growing every day of people who want these board seats, right?
Yes, and not that many board seats turn over every year, and not every one of them is going to be handled by a search firm. So my first bit of my little friendly lecture is there are lots of gatekeepers, and if you think you're ready for a board, we have a guide on the website to creating your board profile, and get that in as many gatekeeper hands as you can. Now, who are the gatekeepers? They're investment bankers taking companies public. They're law firms that regularly advise boards on their governance complexion and standards. And yes, search firms. Groups of entrepreneurs, YPO, and get that board bio in as many hands as you can, because there aren't that many public board seats that come open every year. And in fact, we like to discourage there being excessive board turnover. You want to be on a board 3 to 5 years, maybe longer, maybe 8 years. But my philosophy is if you don't ask, you don't get. So put together your board bio and get it in by the time you're ready for a board, whether you're 30 or 60, you're going to know those gatekeepers just through being good.
And let's be clear, I love that guidance because you want to cast a wider net. You think about your neighbor who's an accountant who might know people, might be working in one of the big firms, etc. There are lots of people to talk to, not just people who are sitting on boards today. But let's put this in the context of someone who listens to the show, goes and downloads your biography about how to write your first board bio, and goes and implements it and sends you an email. not the right way to do it, right? There's a smart way to network because, first of all, you're filling a particular type of board seat. You want to find the right person, expertise. Talk us through what it would actually look like for someone who goes and follows what you guys have as a guide and then wants to network with yourself and some of the other exec search firms. What should they actually do?
Well, I say send the board bio to me because it's not just me. We have dozens and dozens of people doing board searches all over the world, and we have a central library of people who are feeling their board ready. We rank them internally on various criteria. And it's very searchable. When we get a specific assignment, we need a chief information security officer to help this board understand the risks in our data. And that's a really common example. We will be able to search our library of board bios and make some matches happen. Now, can I talk through one-on-one with everybody in the world who wants to sit on a board? Probably not. But I will refer them to someone who works in their area, who has some expertise. Or I'll say, look, we don't have anything to talk about right now, but we'll put your bio in the system, and when there's a match, we'll be back in touch. And then if you multiply that by all the search people you know, all the search firms, all the lawyers, all the investment bankers, odds are you've planted those seeds and something will grow.
And if you, as you said, if you don't ask, you don't get. You've got to put yourself out there and do the networking. And clearly there are events you could go to, whether you're joining National Association of Corporate Directors, other sorts of activities like that, which can become platforms for how you raise your profile. And I know that's how we ended up talking today from that annual event. Do you feel like you find people in a certain way? As in, what's the most valuable way for someone to raise their profile? Should they be giving speeches at conferences? Should they be writing articles and books? What becomes the most useful way for someone to raise their profile, in your opinion?
Well, that's all very helpful. And by the way, in addition to the NACD, I swear by the board list, where I do a lot of education around board governance paths, and Catalyst has always been good at this for women. So there's a lot of things that you can go to and programs that you can apply to, including the Stanford Board College, which is, it's excellent. This is no longer, you can't just approximate board governance. You have to actually be educated in it these days. But I think I'm losing track of your more pointed part of your question. Alexander, can you repeat it?
It was about raising your profile. There are so many ways that someone can go about it, whether it's speaking at conferences, writing articles, authoring books. There's different ways. What's the right way, in your opinion, for someone to raise above the noise and become seen as someone who is an authority figure such that someone in your caliber would find them?
Yes, writing books, speaking at conferences, obviously. That's part of being just, top 1% of who you are. And that's usually my criteria. When I get a board assignment, I go at it from where am I going to find the absolute top person that meets this request. And the request will be a profile. We need a board member who is diverse, who understands audit, to be a future head of the audit chair. Well, I then begin thinking, okay, let's look at our diverse public CFO population. Let's look at people who have had Asia experience, if that's part of the criteria. I usually just go from first principles. I don't just look at a list of who's available for boards. I'm trying to seek out the unknown, if you will.
That makes absolute sense. And so once you raise your profile and you become one of the tallest ducks in the pond and you're an absolute fit with the specs in a job opportunity, you might become one of that slate of candidates that goes forward to meet with the board. And then you need to prepare for that first-time board service interview. And the guidance that I'd give people is this should not be hours. This should be days. You really want to knock this out of the park and do it really well. I would love to hear your thoughts on how someone should go about doing that best.
Dive deep. Do a lot of homework. You're not going to learn, and I put a week into it of understanding the company, talking to people about the company, look at the governance filings at the SEC site, and think through, given whoever's connected you with that board situation, think through what you're supposed to be bringing, and what you can offer in terms of insight, and then back all the way back, because a board interview is much more of a philosophical conversation than a test of what you know. If you're at that table interviewing, you're clearly going to be hugely, deeply knowledgeable yourself, and you'll have done your homework on the company. But don't be tempted to dive in deep in that interview. It is more of a, how do we create value? How do we protect value in an uncertain world? And what are the priorities here for our stakeholders? Is it profitability? Is it growth? Is it moving into new markets? And you want to have sort of even a conversation about the culture of the board and how it matches the culture or doesn't match the culture of the company. So anyway, to summarize, I say do as much homework as you possibly have time for, and then back way off it and have that conceptual conversation, the philosophical conversation.
And this is a lengthy process generally, right? Can you give us an understanding of from the very first time they have a conversation with you to when the whole thing finishes along the line? Help us understand what that actually looks like if you were to pull back the curtain.
It can be a year. It can be a year. Ideally, it's a couple months. But in a non-emergency situation, because boards only meet about 4 times a year on average, not much happens in between those board meetings to advance our board search unless it's an urgent situation. And then you'll see board directors or the selection committee of the board, the nom-gov committee they call it. Then you'll see them move a little faster and do things in between board meetings. The fact still remains, board directors meet 4 times a year in person, and that's when your interview schedule is going to be. And if we just miss it, it's a lot of sitting around and waiting, to be honest.
That makes sense. And I would appreciate your perspective on this. I liken this to dating, right? You're going to go see whether you're a fit with someone else, whether you want to take the next step and carry on the next round, etc. And it's a careful dance between how much you want to talk and how much you want to listen. It's a wonderful thing to learn by listening. Of course, they're going to ask questions. You're going to give answers. It is also a different type of interviewing process from when you're going in to be in the C-suite, an executive, where there you're showing you are a doer and you can get things done. Whereas in the boardroom, you're not there to get things done. A lot more strategy and guidance and coaching and feedback and checking. How do you recommend someone balances this through the interview process? Because, of course, your goal is to make sure you're a fit. You want to learn about the organization and the values, and you'll have done some homework on that, but part of that will be from the conversation. How should someone figure out the right way to go through that process?
Questions. People will judge you by how insightful your questions are, how informed they are. Have you done some basic research on what's the state of the art of governance? What are the expectations of a board? And then I would say it's not so much a dating relationship, Alexander, as it's more like hiring a babysitter for your beloved only child. It's like, am I going to go out to dinner and leave my shareholders, my stakeholders, with this person? And so that's kind of trust. You want to establish trust, credibility, knowledge, responsibility. All the good things that if your baby is alone while you're out to dinner, they'll have utter faith that it's in good hands.
I have not heard an analogy before. I love it. I'm going to use that. I'm going to steal it from now on. That's fantastic. And having just had my second child, I can totally relate to what you're saying. And so let's say someone is successful through this. They've proven they're going to be a very good babysitter, and they're brought forward. And now, ta-da, on the next time they get together in 3 months, they're going to be a new board member, and they want to get off to a strong start. What does that mean?
That means find yourself a board mentor, a member of the board that you've particularly clicked with, who may have years and years and years of experience. Ask them to mentor you. Ask them to help onboard you. Help have lots of conversations with this person. I find that traditional, really experienced board members don't think to do this because it's second nature to them, so they often don't offer this up. But first thing is get that board mentor. Understand through this person the culture of the board. I have a lot of superstars here in Silicon Valley who think that the more they talk talk in the meeting, the better. That's not actually true on a board. You want to start in listening mode. You want to understand what you're going to offer and how much airtime that should take up relative to other concerns of the board. It's figuring out where you fit. If you like my babysitter analogy, this is like being adopted then into a house full of foster care kids. You've got to figure out who's doing what to whom and what the social and professional relationships are going to be.
And there is also, in my mind, a lot of qualified people are sitting around the table. A lot of value to be added by everyone else. Partly to your point about listening in the beginning, learning where you fit in, but also giving the airtime for others. I would liken it to a baseball game where you get up to bat 3, maybe 4 times a game. That's more on the order of the conversation pieces that you should be putting in during the course of a board meeting. But also to your point, there's dynamics there. How does that play out? How does it work? But of course, there's your first board meeting, but there's probably also your first 6 months, which are critical. And there's key things that you should be doing during that time, right?
Yes, and I think it's reading everything, which can be a lot. It's hours and hours and hours a quarter. Going one-on-one with board members, getting to know the management team. You've already figured out how open your CEO is to board members going one-on-one with key people in the C-suite and maybe a level below. It's navigating all of those things as you try and figure out what are the expectations here and what are the responsibilities. And they'll vary quite a bit from board to board.
And do you also recommend people seek feedback on their performance early on?
Well, we in general recommend, and it's a huge percentage of what we spend our time doing, boards should use some mechanism to review their own effectiveness. So yes, individual feedback is great, but the entire board around the table should be doing 360s once a year to be answering key questions about, are we doing enough? Are we doing our job? And that's not unique to a first-time board member. That's every board member.
I agree. I do find there's some irony of when we are all moving up in the career ladder, we probably have annual performance reviews, maybe more frequently than that. We're used to having objectives and seeing how we did against them. And oftentimes the board pushes back against that. I don't need that. We don't need that. It's okay. But we all want to make sure we're doing the best that we can. And especially if you're a first-time board member, I'm sure you're very conscious of that. But everyone should be held to a standard.
Yeah, so feedback should be both informal and very programmatic and formal.
And this wonderful guide that you guys have that we've sort of stepped through today was really written for a first-time corporate board director, but I imagine there are lots of refreshers and lessons learned in there for someone who's at any point in their career. And I would love if we could just take a couple of minutes here towards the end to contrast someone who's a first-time board director versus someone who's been there and done it, whether it's once or multiple times before, in terms of them sort of presenting their candidacy, because maybe they've been a director for a long time, but the world is changing, like we talked about in the beginning. How should they be best bringing themselves forward and connecting with, say, someone like yourself, or positioning themselves or doing their networking?
I do recommend that super experienced board members do a checkup on their skills. Go to the Stanford Law School has a board college. I think MIT has one. The NACD has one. Just brush up on what are the key hot button issues that you may have been so submerged in your focus on your existing board work that it might be time for a refresh. And then as boards get more and more and more diverse, board members of the traditional mold, meaning, white public company CEOs, I'll sometimes tell them, it may not be your year to add another board. There are other things going on.
Well, there's a key part that we didn't talk about is it's an appropriate time to ask for permission if you're on a board from whether you can go get another one sometimes, right?
That's a big issue. It's an issue if you are not a CEO and you're reporting into people who have to, you're accountable for what time you spend away from your job. There are all kinds of conflict issues that we have to dive into pretty quickly before anyone spends too many months of time interviewing and so on. I have had situations where a really good candidate's employer just said, no, that's a conflict. We're moving into that business next year. or the general counsel says, no, that's a key customer and you'd have to recuse yourself from everything. I like to get to the bottom of where the conflicts are really early in the process so that both sides don't waste their time.
And I know that there's a careful dance behind this. So Cheryl Batchelder, who's been on the boards of 4 different companies and CEO of multiple companies, she was explaining it to me on one of the episodes that you need to figure out where you are in the process. You need to do it before you become a finalist candidate, but you don't want to do it too early in case you actually don't progress with the company and look bad as if you're looking for another opportunity. So I imagine everyone has to figure out the right timing for them. Is that how you think about it, Martha?
I do, but I think once you've had the conversation with your CEO, assuming you're not the CEO, once you've had the conversation, I'm going to look for a public board. Do I have your approval and sponsorship for that goal? And I've just written an article that says every CEO should say yes, and put some guardrails on it. But then I think, it depends on how thick or thin your skin is. I think the only way it's embarrassing if you ask conceptually, can I explore this board, and you don't get it, I wouldn't be that embarrassed about it. Most people statistically do not get the board seat they're interviewing for because there's 6 or 7 other options. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's a dance, except for I would tend to counsel just be open and check out the conflict early. And it sounds like just a responsible thing to me.
And of course, the timeline is usually not instantaneous either, right? We're talking a multi-year commitment usually to make this happen.
No, but, the first step is obviously if you're a CEO, get your board's permission. If you're not a CEO, get your CEO's permission and your general counsel's permission to explore boards in general, and then bring specific ones up if you think there might be a conflict. What you don't want to do is get all the way to the end, get a board offer, and have your own company say you can't do it. Mm-hmm. Everybody has then wasted months and months of time, and everybody feels really terrible about that.
And no one wants that feeling on any of the sides. Martha, I am grateful for this wonderful 2 publications, actually, that you guys have put out there. They're easily digestible. They're wonderful cheat sheets for everybody. As you said, the most popular download that you've had from your site. We will make sure we link to the show notes into that, and you've very generously offered for people, if they feel like they're good candidates, to put forward their board bio for the database with you. Is there any sort of nuggets that are really key to this discussion that we haven't covered yet today?
I can't think of it, but it will be really interesting to watch how boards evolve in the next 20 years now that we have, everybody moans that diversity is so low, but it's actually unprecedentedly large today, and how will governance change as you've got many, many different kinds of voices around the table. So I'll be interested in tracking that, hopefully with you, Alexander.
Well, I can say I'm proud to be a member of the steering committee for the 2020 Women on Boards, and it's, in some ways, they've been so successful helping raise the profile, as have other great organizations, that they've got a branding problem. They hit 20% this year, and next year's 2020, so they will have to rethink that. But I was just had a conversation with someone else who said, my goal isn't 20% or 30%, it's parity. So, and clearly we're talking about more than gender. We want diversity of thought in all its different forms. So it'll be fascinating to see how the boardroom will continue to evolve for the good of the shareholders and the good of the employees and the public and the government. So we need the good people doing the good work in there, and we are grateful for all the guidance that you're giving to help that happen. So Martha, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Martha Josephson. I love the 2 guides that she has given us today: how to write your first board bio and the path to the boardroom in terms of positioning yourself, interviewing, and being successful once you're on a board. This is the cheat sheet that all of us need to know. It's easily digestible. It's very short. It's well written, great insights, and it's from someone who places board directors, so she knows what she's talking about. And you can get those guides over at podcast.gordon.edu. Now, please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more strategies and stories from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.